Hi there, and a very warm welcome to this week's eagerly awaited Universal Camera Quick Tip. This might be running into a quickish tip territory, so above 20 minutes, but let's see. So this tutorial is all about the Universal Camera and its capabilities of mimicking real-world lenses in terms of what the bokeh is looking like. The Universal Camera can do a lot of things, but I will be more exclusively talking about its bokeh shaping abilities. If you like the content that I'm providing, please consider subscribing to my Patreon. The link is down in the description. Now, without any further ado, let's get started. So, since this is one of those more technical sessions, welcome to chart time. We can't talk about bokeh and lenses without at least understanding a little bit about them. So let's talk about the most basic sort of camera, the pinhole camera first. As the name implies, instead of a lens, the pinhole camera has actually a very small hole that makes all the light bundle and squeeze through that narrow hole here. So the smaller the hole, the sharper the image, and therefore also this lens doesn't have depth of field. Everything has the same sharpness no matter if close or far away from the lens. And basically you adjust your field of view by moving the hole closer or further away from the sensor. And this is basically your focal length. So if that mechanism works so well, why even build lenses? Well, there are some inherent problems, and those come with exposure. So since you're squeezing light through a very tiny hole, you only left with one exposure for every lighting situation. Of course, you can also change the emulsion of your sensor blade, or if it's digital, you change the ISO, but we leave that out for now. So to get more light into your camera, you have to have a bigger opening. And to get a bigger opening, you have to have another mechanism to focus the light. Because if you just open up the pinhole, you get a very blurry image. So let's have a look at a typical 50mm lens. This looks very complicated in comparison to just having a hole. And you might think this is a very complicated lens, but actually it isn't. For the preparation of this tutorial, I looked at a lot of cross-sections for 50mm lenses, and believe it or not, this was one of the simpler ones. So you might say, why is there so much glass here? And basically this is because there needs to be a lot of corrections for modern digital sensors that have a very high resolution. So even the most simplest of lenses, as a typical 50mm lens, has a lot of glass and correction elements inside of it. Now we are not going to talk about every single one of them, we are just talking about the basics of the lens. So let's carry on to the next slide. So let's compress the assembly group into one symbol of the lens, which is just one class element. And what is the lens doing? It lets light inside of the camera and focuses it on the sensor. This focus point has an equivalent on the outside of the camera in the real world, and this is on the focal plane. Now the focal plane is a plane where all the light is focused towards the sensor. And you can actually adjust that to your liking by bringing it closer or further away from the camera by simply focusing the lens. So if you focus on something, not necessarily all the points lie within the focal plane. So of course there's points in front or points behind the focal plane. So what is really important to know is that these points are also in front or behind the sensor plane here. So you get a defocus point. Now the red marked areas here are usually circles. Those are called circles of confusion, and they grow the more the object is out of focus, so in front or behind the focal plane. Let me talk about the aperture real quick. So when we open or close the aperture, we let more or less light into the camera. And therefore we can adjust our brightness or the exposure time. But there's something connected to that, so let's open up the aperture in our next frame here, and you can see that the out of focus areas actually have grown. And this is because the hole is bigger and therefore the angles are steeper, and those create a bigger circle of confusion. So the wider open your aperture is, the blurrier your out of focus areas will become. So for completeness sake, here's a chart where the point is actually behind the focal plane, and we can see the same principle applies, so it's just the other way around. So let's sum up real quick before we actually jump into our 3D scene and handle our universal camera. So a lens has a focal plane which we can focus, and therefore everything that's on the focal plane is also focused on the sensor. Points in front or beyond that focal plane are also in front or behind the sensor plane. That means they hit our sensor in a diffused way by a circle of confusion. And this is also what creates our bokeh. Last but not least, we have the aperture, and by opening up or closing down, we let more or less light onto our camera. So if you think of the pinhole camera, which has a very small aperture, everything is sharp from front to back. So the more you open up the aperture, the wider the angles are and the bigger the circle of confusion, meaning that your fore or background from the focal plane gets more shallow depth of field. Alright, let's actually jump into 3D and have a look at our universal camera. So welcome to 3D world. In our 3D scene I opted for a very simplified scene, so let's get out of the camera. What we have here is just a couple of points that going beyond the focal plane, which is in the middle. So if we render, we see something like this. Now this is not very convincing bokeh effects here, and this is because our camera is missing the Octane camera tag, which we will need to also gain access to the universal camera. So let's create a tag by right-clicking, Extensions, Octane, and Octane camera tag. Here we go. Now by default you are greeted with the usual thin lens camera, which you might already know. But if you go to that drop-down menu here and drop it down, you can see that there's actually a lot of different cameras in here, including the universal camera. And that's what we're going to choose here. Still nothing has changed, and this is because our f-stop is set to infinite. And this means we are basically having a pinhole camera right now. This is not the standard setting Octane ships with, but I made it my standard setting because I want this to be infinite by default, so I don't accidentally have depth of field where I don't want it. So you can do so by going in here, Custom, Save Preset, and then set it as default and press OK. Also, by the way, I don't like the autofocus, so I just always want to focus using the built-in focus distance with the Cinema 4D camera. And you can do so by disabling the autofocus and setting the focal depth to 0. That activates the Cinema 4D focal depth option. Okay, let's start getting our setup dialed in. So first of all, we want to give our lens an f-stop, and this is exactly the same as you would find on our real-world cameras or real-world lenses. So if we start with an f-stop of 5, we get a little bit of a circle of confusion here in the front and in the back of our focal plane here. Now if we go with a smaller number, the circle of confusion gets bigger. The camera here ignores that more light should enter the camera the bigger the aperture is. This can also be an advantage actually, so we don't have to adjust our exposure all the time to compensate for the more or less light entering the camera. So what you're seeing now is a pretty perfect bokeh that usually no lens in real world has. As you have seen, lenses are really complicated and all the glass in there makes light bend in different ways. And therefore the bokeh usually gets a character. And this is what the universal camera is so good for. We can give our bokeh some character so it doesn't look as clean and basically dead as this is. So I always try to make those topics more interesting, but in this case there's just a lot of settings we need to go through. So I hope you have your coffee ready to not fall asleep. Alright, let's first talk about the camera mode here. And we know thin lens from the standard thin lens camera here. So if we roll that menu down, you can see that the universal camera can actually do a lot more things than just thin lens. But since we are talking about rendering a scene normally with just fancy bokeh, we are sticking with thin lens and leaving those other lenses out for now. Because if we also would talk about those, you would probably fall asleep and we'd have another 50-minute video on our hands. Alright, let's actually talk about the aperture shape drop down here. So if I drop that down, you can see that we have multiple shapes to choose from. Now, this is a small gripe here, so depending on what you choose here, only a couple of those sliders are going to be active. Now, they are not grayed out if they are inactive, so you don't know which slider to choose. And this is where I come in, because I prepared another chart time. So here we go. So welcome to chart time, but wait, it's Cinema 4D chart time. Okay, so you can see I have made a chart for every one of those apertures, so the circular, the polygonal and the notched aperture, with their respective settings underneath. So you can see what the settings are doing and what settings are even associated to that aperture. So let's have a look what the actual similarities are between all of those lens models. So of course the one similarity you have is the f-stop, because you want to increase and decrease the bokeh of your scenes, no matter what shape the aperture is. Next, you can change the aspect ratio to squeeze and stretch them here. So if you want to mimic a anamorphic lens, you can set this to 2. And this goes for all of those lenses too, so you can see we can squeeze and stretch them all. Here we go, let's set them back to 1. Lastly, what's also there is the aperture edge, and this is you can emphasize rather the edge or the middle of the lens with the bokeh. No real-world lens is perfect, so usually they have rather an emphasis on the bokeh towards the rim or the bokeh towards the center. So you can mix and match and find your own best solution. And this is a setting that's also common for all of the aperture types listed here. So the only other thing the circular aperture is capable of doing is to mimic a central obstruction. What is a central obstruction? Basically, if you have a mirror lens, so not consisting of glass elements but of mirrors, usually you find that in telescopes, you usually have a central mirror obscuring the image, and this gives you a very typical look. So with the circular aperture you can mimic this behavior. And this is everything the circular aperture can do. Basically, the polygonal aperture is the one you have in your standard Octane camera, so it more or less has the same feature range. So what doesn't really require explanation is that you can change the blade count, so you can change and mix and match your blade amount. What I really like with this aperture is the aperture roundness, so let's set the blade count actually to 4, and we end up with a square. So if you want to be the square really rectangular, you can set the aperture roundness to 0, while if you set it to 1, you keep the circle. And you can go with all states in between those. And that's really what I like about this aperture. Now, lastly, if you are not satisfied with the rotation, you can also set the rotation here and rotate your square around. So if you want that aligned to the edges of your frame, you would go with a 45-degree angle. Here we go. Alright, last but not least, it's the notched aperture. So if you are thinking, what the hell is a notched aperture? Here's a video for you that shows you the inefficiencies of real-world apertures. So when the blade count is not enough, so to save money or what, you have notches in there, especially with big aperture openings, as you can see here. So when it comes to lenses and mimicking the aperture to every last detail, this might be something interesting you want to acquire. So basically the notched aperture has everything the polygonal aperture has, but with the extra notch settings. So what you can do here is move the notch around, so you can also make a star aperture, for example, if you want to do so. So the notch can be moved and the notch depth can be set. So for example, if you want to go with a star here, you can do so like this. Now what all of those apertures have in common is that they are synthetic in nature and thus they render relatively fast. If you have keen eyes, you have noticed that I missed out on one other aperture, and this is the custom aperture, which we will look at next. Okay, back in 3D, because the custom aperture is best practice here, so let's go to custom, and you can see our render turns black, but the aperture texture slot here just appeared. So best practice is to load the texture via image texture. So let's do this by going to plugins and to image texture here. Let's go inside and actually load an aperture map. So let's go on the aperture map side. So basically those are cutouts from real-world bokeh to give your render the most detail. So let's go with the rather contrasty one here and click that. Here we go, re-render, and let's see what it's doing. You can see now it's working just fine. The bokeh in front of the focus plane is flipped as it should be, but you can notice two things. One thing is that the image here is becoming very dark, and secondly, it's becoming very noisy. And I have to warn you that rendering with custom bokeh and non-synthetic bokehs can increase your render times by quite a bit. So basically the map here is obscuring your lens, so the more darkness there is in your map here, the more darker your render will become, and you have to fight that with the camera exposure. Now this is very inefficient, it creates nice bokeh shapes, but on the other hand it also creates a lot of noise, and if your scene is more complicated than a couple of glowing dots here, then it becomes very time consuming to render it noise free. So my advice is to not use the custom map if you don't really need to. So apart from the aperture texture which we just looked at, we didn't even go into depths of the universal camera. Yes, we spoke about the bokeh shapes, but there's even more to the universal camera than just the bokeh shapes. Now, this is a bit jumbled again, so we have to figure out what menu points are of use to us. Of course, I already know, so let's open those ones that are connected to the universal camera in the thin lens mode. So one is the Optical Vignetting, second is the Distortions, and third is the Aberrations. So all of those settings are useful for us. To not waste render time on the aperture texture, let's actually set this back to the most basic shape, which is circular. And since distortion is not doing anything to the bokeh itself, let's twirl it closed and only go with the optical vignetting and the aberration settings here. So let's start from the top by having a look at the optical vignetting settings here. So what is optical vignetting? So if you look through a lens, you have a round opening, but if you look through it sideways, the round opening becomes oval. And this can actually lead to oval bokeh shapes on the rim of your image. In optics, you could avoid that by making the front glass bigger, but this also adds a lot of cost to the lens, so your lens would be more expensive. But since the cost is a very important factor, you can find optical vignetting even on modern lenses. So let's have a look in our 3D scene. So basically what optical vignetting is doing is creating a round or a donut shape that's closing into the center of the lens in front of our camera. So let's do so by going to the distance slider and slide it up. And you can see now the optical vignetting is in place. And you can see why optical vignetting is also known as cat's eye effect. But be aware, some of the lens settings as f-stop and your focal length will have an effect on it. So if I go to the f-stop and increase it slightly, you can see that actually we are obscuring part of the image by the setting of the distance here. So if you make that setting too small with the bokeh not being great enough, you can actually eat into the image. So my advice is to set the setting by a lens by lens basis and just dial it in as you want it and not go with any presets. Last but not least, you have to be aware of the side effects also when the image is looking good. So if we have optical vignetting in place here, you can see that other aspects that are also happening in real-world lenses are taking place here too. So since this is a vignetting effect, you have darker outsides of the image here. And this is also in your 3D renders. So we are going to have a look at our 3D scene later with the LEDs, where we will dial in a nice bokeh shape for our universal camera. So you will be able to see the darkening of the corners effect better there. Okay, let's reset this to its defaults and move on with the spherical aberration now. Okay, explanation time. So let's actually start with a perfect lens. So with a perfect lens, all the rays converge through the focal plane. So basically that means we have a very even bokeh and the focal plane is completely in focus. Even with modern lenses there are imperfections, so what can happen is that the outer and the inner parts or the center parts of the lens are focusing on different planes. So right now the focus of the lens is skewed in a way that the outer parts of the lenses are focusing in front of the focal plane, while the middle parts of the lens are focusing behind the focal plane. So we get an emphasis on the rim of the bokeh in front of the focal plane and an emphasis on the center of the bokeh behind the focal plane. Dependent on the lens, this can be also reversed. So for example, now the center of the lens is focused in front of the focal plane, while the rim of the lens is focusing behind the center plane. So as you might expect, the bokeh shape just inverts. So we have an emphasis on the center in front of the focal plane and an emphasis on the rim behind the focal plane. Also notice that because there's no exact point in space where all the rays converge, also our focal plane now is slightly out of focus because some of the rays don't have focused yet and some of the rays already have focused. So if you are a photographer, there's one thing that always works, and this is close down the aperture, because by closing down the aperture you get rid of some of the rays and focus through more of the center of the lens, and therefore you narrow down your focus point. And this is also a reason why shooting with a narrower aperture is giving you sharper images. Back in the scene, let's actually see if the spherical aberration has the expected results. So let's bring in a positive value, and you can see that even a very small value has a great effect. And as so often in Octane, this goes for all of these sliders. So what we can see here is in front of the focal plane we have an emphasis on the center, while behind the focal plane we have an emphasis on the edge. And this is what we expect. So now if we invert that value and go into the negative direction, we would expect that value to change to the opposite side. And yes, as you can see, these sides have swapped. But what you can also see is that our focus point has shifted. This is also something that happens with all of those sliders here. So let's see where the focus goes. So if we go into positive values, we sort of have a back focus. So the focus is actually further away than we measured it. And when we go into negative values, it goes the other way around. So it's closer than we measured it, because we didn't change the focus, and the middle here should always be in focus. So the funny thing is then when we deal with imperfections of lenses, we get all sorts of imperfections, also focus shifting. So to deal with that, we would go to the camera and let's go to the side view to see what we are doing and then compensate for that. So since we are back focusing, we have to focus in front of the actual thing to get our focus back on track. So the focus offset for this setting here, so it depends on the value here in the spherical aberration, you have to offset it by 7 to 8 units now. And this is something to keep in mind, because if you already have animated your scene with your focus in the right spot, you would have to offset your focus for the whole animation if you set something like Spherical Aberration in your universal camera settings. Okay, so let's actually reset that and go back to our standards here. And then let's talk about Coma. As you might have noticed, the Spherical Aberration Coma and Astigmatism is all part of the aberration group. And this is because they have all something in common. And this is how the light refracts through lenses and therefore its imperfections. So while Spherical Aberration was the center versus the rim of the lens, Coma is actually the angle of the light in which the rays are shot through the lens. So let's have a chart time once more. So in a perfect world, all those rays would converge on the focal plane here, but with the diagonality of the rays, they are having the same problem as with the Spherical Aberration before. So let's actually have a look what this looks like in the render. Alright, let's slide the Coma around. So if we do that, you can also see the focus is shifting again. But if we let this render, you can see the Coma is producing elongated bokeh shapes here. So let's compensate the focus for a minute here. So you can see it sort of has the same effect as the Spherical Aberration, but with a slight perspective to it. And I even have another scene to show you that a little bit better. So if we switch scenes here for a minute, you can see that now I have a scene here where we, instead of a continuous pattern that goes in focus and then out of focus again, we have one plane in front of the focus plane, one plane directly on the focus plane, and one plane after the focus plane. So if we render that, you can see that funny pattern here appearing, with the blue dots being the bokeh in front of the focus plane and the green dots behind the focus plane, and the white ones are directly on it. So now let's go to our universal camera and also shift the bokeh here. And you can see that now the focus also shifts, but you can see the shape a little bit better. And the shape is actually cone-like. So the best way to describe the Coma is that you can get a cone-like bokeh shape. So it almost looks 3D, so the emphasis is towards the rim. And you can see that we get a cone-like appearance here, and the distribution of the brightness values also reflect that. Of course, in a real-world scene you would rather stick to very low values, as this would mean that you would have a really bad lens, which in most situations you don't have. Alright, now let's care about astigmatism. So let's get rid of our Coma here and talk about astigmatism. Now the graphics for this is very advanced, so I'm not going to do it my own, but show you the Wikipedia picture. Here we go. So with astigmatism you have one point that is focused in different ways dependent on the light's direction through the lens. So if the light is traveling through it horizontally, you have a different focal point than if it's traveling through it vertically. Let's see how this looks like. So let's go to astigmatism here and move the slider. Now you can see some infinity signs forming here, and this is basically how it is. Also notice the direction change, whether the defocused element is in front or behind the focal plane. If you want it the other way around, of course you can go with a negative value here, and now it's switched around. Also notice that even sharp objects, so objects on the focal plane, are getting defocused the closer they move to the rim of the image. And basically we have this 4-leaf clover representation here. Alright, on to the last point, which is the field curvature. So what is this doing? As you might have guessed, chart time again. So the field curvature is very easy to understand. So while the focal plane usually is parallel to the sensor and a straight line, field curvature curves that line in front or in the back of the initially straight line here. So all points that lie on that curve will now be in focus. Let's see what this means for our 3D scene. So here, if we curve the field curvature far enough, we can even make the points in front of our focal plane in focus on the rim here. So let's try to do that by getting in a focal plane. So we have to move the point really far. So now we can see that the yellow points are still sharp in the middle, while in the rim, the blue points that are in front of the focal plane usually are sharp now. So we curved our focal plane in a way to catch both of those points. Okay, so that's all of the theory right now, so let's actually jump into our LED scene and dial in our universal camera so you can see what I usually do to get my nice bokeh going. Okay, welcome to our LED scene where we finally dial in the universal camera settings into a production scene. Sort of. So compared to the intro, you can see that this scene is looking nothing alike that, and it's really poor in quality without the depth of field. So let's change this by getting to our camera, right click, go to extensions and giving it a Octane camera tag. Inside of the camera tag, let's go to the camera type and set it to universal. I think it's a good practice to work from the top to the bottom, so first of all, let's give our scene an f-stop and let's get a realistic f-stop of a number 5. Now everything becomes blurred, and this is because our focus distance is far off, so it's way beyond the scene here. So let's actually pick that from the chip here, somewhere around there. Okay, this already looks a little bit nicer. Something like our scene. Now, something like this would totally be doable without the universal camera, so let's get this dialed up a little bit better. So next in here, we want to actually make the depth of field area or the bokeh a little bit bigger, so we can do that by decreasing the f-stop even more, so let's say 2.5 here. Alright, so now we're going into the territory our final render was looking like. So if you are into round bouquets, you're already done, but as I said, this also could have been done in the usual camera, in the normal thin lens camera of Octane. So what we need to do, or what I want to do here, is go and set this to the notched camera here. And also what I don't like is the 5 blades here. I want to have more blades than 5, so actually I want to make those 9 blades. And let's go with the render region to emphasize those bokehs so we can see it better and don't have to render all the image. Now the notch is a little bit too drastic for my taste, so what I'm going to do here is to make it more shallow by going to a scale of 0.25. And also the notch position is a little bit too drastic, a little bit too close to the edge, so I'm going with minus 0.5 here. Also, we didn't talk about the aperture edge here. Usually this is set to 1, and this gives us a very soft bokeh, but I always like to emphasize the rim a little bit more, so I'm going to get the aperture to 2, because this emphasizes the bokeh a little bit more, so it becomes more visible. Now this would be completely the opposite what a photographer would do. Photographers don't like the bokeh as it's pronounced. They want to have a soft appearance, so they would rather go with a negative value where the center of the bokeh would be emphasized. But let's go back to the value of 2 here. And basically this is all what I want to set for the main depth of field parameters here. So what we can do elsewise is get a optical vignetting going. So we will go and set our render region to the side here, because you will see the optical vignetting on this portion best. So what I want to do here is get in a distance of 0.15. No, that was too much. So if I get rid of the render region here, you can see now we are just left with the middle portion of our render. And I leave this in to show you that bigger values have a very strong impact on your render. So actually what I want is a value of 0.015. Here we go. And as you can see now, this elongates our bokeh on the edge. So it cuts off parts of the bokeh, and therefore it looks nice and like a real-world camera. What you also can see is that now we have some vignetting going on. So when I turn that off by setting it back to 0, you can see the edges of the frame actually become a little bit lighter. So while the bokeh is cut off, your edges become darker as well. And believe it or not, this is everything I did to my render, so I didn't even touch the aberration section here. You can do so to emphasize the bokeh a little bit more. For example, you can go to the astigmatism and put that up and therefore elongate your bokeh a little bit more. Let's see, let's overdo it here. And let's also go for the render region. So this seems to be going into the wrong direction. So what I want to do is go for a negative value here. And now you can see now we have the elongated bokeh like really strongly emphasized here. Obviously this looks like a really bad lens, so don't overdo it with those values, just keep them reasonable. Now this is too much for my taste, so I go back to 0 on this. There's actually one more last thing I didn't show in the initial video here, and this is the split focus diopter. So what this is doing is giving you basically two separate lenses that you can choose where in your picture they are located. So if I turn that on and maybe also show guides, you can see you have a transition area from our lens to the split diopter lens. So you have a second depth of field you can set here. And this depth of field is set in Octane units, so 1 means 100 Cinema 4D units. So in order to have anything in focus here, we need to get this a lot smaller. So if you go back to the camera, we have around 131. So let's actually get this to 130. So that would mean that our focus here could be 0.13. And this would make the camera, the split diopter, the same focal depth as our main camera, so you don't see any difference anymore. But now if I push that to the back, for example, let's go for 0.2, you can see suddenly now the back of our object is in focus, whereas the front of the object is in focus with our original lens. So you have a lot of control with the orientation and stuff like that. So you can also turn that rotation around so you get the transition in different ways. Also, you can change the transition area to a broader area. So for example, if a client would ask you to have all the chips here in focus, and this wouldn't be possible with a normal lens, you would be able to do that with a split focus diopter. I actually didn't plan to do this, but let's show you. So what I would do is go to the main camera and actually focus it to the back here. So let's actually focus it here. And then with our diopter, we would focus on this point. So I'm just focusing on this point to see what value comes out of there. So 115, okay. So let's do this. Let's go into our universal camera. Let's go down to our split focus diopter and set this to 115 or 0.115. Here we go. And now what we want to do is get the transition here a little bit broader. So we go to our boundary width and just actually make it wider, and then maybe move it down a little. So let's see, let's move it on the x-axis here. So while it's not perfect, you can see that a lot of the front objects here are in focus now. So the focus basically is following our crooked line. And I'm sure that with a little bit of massaging, you will just get it right. And of course, before finally rendering, you should turn off the show guide, otherwise it would turn up in the renderer. Alright, so let's turn off the split focus diopter and render our image as it is. So let's refocus our camera again. And that's basically it. That's the whole secret of the universal camera. So if you're still here and still awake, congratulations, you made it to the end of the tutorial. Thank you very much for staying with me all the time. So basically, this is the third day of preparing and recording this tutorial, so a lot of effort went into it. So I really hope there's something in it you can take with you or inspire you. If you want to make sure I can put the same amount of effort into future projects, you can actually help me by becoming a Patreon, which basically pays the time I need for those projects to manifest. After this long tutorial, I'm guessing next week will be a short one again. I'm not sure which topic I go with next, so if you have any suggestions, please let me know. Other than that, I wish you a great week, a good time, and happy focusing. Bye!